Hello. Welcome back to the JLL coaching pod. Today we're talking about squatting. I think people are quite obsessed with squatting. I've been guilty of that as well. I've always kind of been like, wow, squats. It's just a super challenging movement, and it's kind of part of our structure. If you look around the world, everybody sits in these deep squats and always have. That's kind of how we've evolved. Maybe that's why there's part of this fascination around squatting, and particularly how much weight someone can come out of that deep squat with. I was absolutely obsessed. It was probably the thing I was best at as a younger gym goer. I remember maybe 3 or 4 years into my lifting career in my old school bodybuilding gym, rusty weights, loads of kind of dust everywhere. That was the vibe. Loads of steroided up guys, massive as hell, big as me almost. And I used to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, hang out with my dog a little bit of pre-workout, and head straight to the gym. This was all before work. And I remember I think it was Wednesdays I'd have these 5x5 workouts that were just like absolute hell. And if you looked at it like rationally, even with an ounce of logic, you'd be like, what is this kid doing? Because effectively I was doing a 5x5, 5 sets of 5 reps each week. And each week I was adding 2.5 kilos. So I got it up to 145 kilos. And I think I was 18 years old for 5 sets of 5. And I remember I was grinding out reps. You can actually look on my old YouTube channel to see these workouts. It was an absolute grind. And I was like screaming my butt off. My knees would always kill me afterwards. Absolutely kill me for the following days after. But it was fun. It was the start of the squatting session. Then my knees started to hurt and I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. Because the pain outweighed the fun. And that was kind of my PB at the time. Like, I don't remember squatting more than that. So I was PBing my 1 rep max for 5 sets of 5 and just going ham. I never tested. I should have tested, regrettably, because I was just young and fucking ready to go. And I should have used that energy to kind of max out and hit, I don't know, a bit more than that. But that was kind of the start of my squatting obsession. Just pausing for a sip of coffee. And then I kind of had back pain after that. A year on, that was when my back pain got really bad. I was living out of my car in Australia and my back got really bad. So every time I do a bilateral back squat, which is all I knew really what to do, or front squats, my back would hurt. So I was like, all right, I'm not doing this. And as I started to become a PT, first time doing a PT in 2019, 5 years ago, I was becoming obsessed with ankle mobility because everyone's like, yep, got to improve the ankle mobility so the knees can go further forward over the toes, and then you can get deeper in a squat. Your squat looks pretty, and that's what I was all obsessed with. That's definitely wrong. We'll dive into like how that can be improved and how there's more factors. Dorsiflexion, effectively your knee traveling over your toes, is a factor naturally. How far your knees will be able to go forward over your toes will dictate how far down you can get in a squat, etc., etc. But it's just a little small part of the puzzle that people get entirely obsessed with, and I was also obsessed with that as well. Today we're just going to kind of dive into like, what is a squat? Why are people obsessed with it? What dictates a good squat? How often to squat? And what it takes to get good at squatting. Because that's, I think, pretty interesting. Like, how do we actually get good at this thing that everyone's obsessed with? And we'll talk about what actually is good. Like, what is good? One of my worst injuries in the gym was from back squatting. And even just like saying this, my tummy's like, hey mate, just so you know, we remember that was bad. But I think it wasn't even anything particularly heavy, maybe 130 on a back squat. And down at the bottom of the squat, I heard a little, and my back just pops, and it's just like shooting sharp pain, lying in bed for a couple of days. Back then, I didn't really know what to do with the back pain. Like, So I just was in pain for months. Still training, like, got to get back in there. But I definitely have a bit of fear over those back squats still. Anything too heavy. Front squats I can load up to the gills. So it's definitely a psychological thing rather than an actual problem. Like, I'm now front squatting PBs, 130 kg recently. Pretty proud of that number. I think 140 is on the cards later this year once I build my weight back up. On the front squat. That'll be a huge front squat for someone like me. There are other, obviously, big dogs who are squatting way more than that, but for me personally, 140 would be huge. So back pain is a lot of history around me. I loved it. I was obsessed with it. Got obsessed with trying to get better with its ankle mobility, and then back pain later on. And now I would say I'm kind of like, I'm in the, squatting, I'm kind of neutral. Still a bit of fear around the back squat, but I do enjoy it. Now, what dictates a good squat? What does a good squat actually look like? Pat Davidson gives me the best definition because he's my hero, and it's just like a vertical translation of the pelvis and rib cage, or vertical translation of the pelvic floor and the diaphragm up and down. Kind of moving, you can picture your torso moving up and down in a lift, straight up and down in an elevator, and your knees just traveling forwards and backwards as you move up and down. So you're basically a nice upright torso, straight up and down. That is the epitome of a good squat. If you look at Olympic lifters, the way they catch a clean, they're very upright in the position. For me, that is what I would consider a good squat. Now, why would I consider that a good squat? This is the most important thing, in my opinion. And that all comes down to the outcome you're looking for. Why are you squatting in the first place? And this is where the conversation has so much nuance. Because if you're squatting for most load possible, what I've just said means nothing. If you're trying to be the strongest squatter in the world, you're going to throw the weight on your back, you're going to hinge forward, and your torso is not going to move up and down. You're in a kind of like upright stance. You're going to be leaning over. You're going to use your back musculature more, your glutes more, be a more hip dominant squat. And that's a different story. So if you want to lift the most amount of weight, the technique that you'll use will be very different to if, say, you want to develop your quads, the front side of your legs. So outcome that you are looking for will dictate the quality of your squat. There's no such thing as a good or a bad squat without some kind of reference to what you're squatting for. So generally with my training, I'm never really trying to just squat the most amount of weight in any means necessary. Again, probably because I'm scared of the back squat. But for me, I'm generally squatting to develop my quad musculature, be powerful through that particular movement pattern. And that's kind of the main outcomes that I'm looking for personally and typically with my clients. The reason why is because if you do heavy low bar back squats, typically you're just going to be driving a very similar motor pattern or movement pattern to a deadlift, because it's just a lot of kind of sending the hips backward, loading the glutes, loading the back, and there's not that much going through the knee musculature, the knee extensors. So that's why I'm like, if I want to train my butt or my back, I'll do a hinge movement pattern, a deadlift, an RDL, something along those lines. If I want to train the front of my legs and still the hips, I will do a knee dominant movement pattern where I'm more upright with the torso, knees go through a bigger range of motion, and that will be the limiting factor. Now, when I first started Third Space, I had a massive debate with the head of education about if a squat is knee or hip dominant. And for me, the answer of that is, well, it depends what you want to get out of the squat, the outcome that you're looking for. And it can be a knee or hip dominant either way, but typically with any squat, even this heavy back squat, the limiting factors will typically be either your ability to maintain a kind of rigid axial skeleton. You might see the bar fall over the front of the individual, or they just can't manage the load with their torso, axial skeleton being everything that's not their arms or their legs, or the knees, just the knee musculature, the knee extensors simply not being strong enough. Quads not being strong enough to manage the load to get them back out up of that low squat position. And for me, again, with this lens of outcome-driven, results-driven squats, typically I want to make my squats knee dominant. And dominant meaning I'm causing a stimulus that will be the biggest stimulus in that musculature. Maybe the hips will be used more, but the quad musculature will be the limiting factor and therefore receive the highest level of stimulus in order to grow. So a higher level, relatively, of mechanical tension within the knee extensor musculature, the quads, versus the hips, in order to kind of elicit that response, that muscular hypertrophic response. I hope that makes sense. So just to clarify, I'm going to make that a little bit more straightforward. Is a squat knee or hip dominant? My response is generally it's a knee dominant movement because we're trying to get the outcome of developing the quads, and typically they will be the limiting factor with regards to the lower limb musculature. Things to consider for squatting. So this is super important. Like, you'll always see some people, they can do pistol squats, they can do really nice, beautiful upright squats. The Asians, the Chinese always get loads of kind of praise for their amazing squatting ability. And that's typically because they've got a shorter femur with regards to their tibia and torso length. They've got a long torso, short femur, and that enables them to stay nice and upright in a squat. And this kind of has a huge impact on your ability to stay upright in a squat. How short are your femurs? That my girlfriend Eleanor has the shortest femurs in the world, and she can squat really nicely. She can do pistol squats easily, whereas me, I've got a longer femur. I'm not the best squatter. It's probably why I hurt my back, because I typically will send a lot of load through my back and my hips during a squat. That's why I got that fat ass. One of the reasons why I got that fat ass is because, again, I've got long femurs, so when I do a squatting pattern, I'm super biased to leaning forward to get all the way down into the bottom of a squat position, and that will typically load my glutes to the high heavens. So it's really hard for me to develop the quads, so I've really got to put in the effort to kind of set up my squat to help me bias more of the quads. That could be something like holding the weight in front of me, increasing the length of my tibia, increasing the length, I'm putting in quotation marks, by putting myself on a ramp. That's why you would use that ramp. One of the reasons why you'd use a slant board or a ramp under your heels is to increase the length of that bone, so the ratio of tibia to femur to torso changes, and you can be more upright in a squat. With this different lens that I've recently been learning through, just give me 1 second. With regards to kind of Bill Hartman's model, and what that takes into consideration as well is the pelvic floor. Now, the pelvic floor, if you look at the bottom pelvic outlet, bottom part of the pelvis, there is musculature there, naturally. And you can consider that the diaphragm of the pelvis, that bottom part of the pelvis. And for a really good squat, you need a posterior concentrically biased musculature. So the back half of that pelvic outlet needs to be concentrically biased, and you can think of that kind of closing the sacrum, like pushing forward the pelvis, and that enables you to sit back and down into a nice squat. Whereas you want the anterior or the front half of that pelvic outlet musculature to be eccentrically biased, to kind of accept the guts and let yourself lower down. Now, that took me ages to get my head around, so if that means nothing to you, completely understandable, but that's what you kind of want with regards to the pelvic outlet musculature orientation. Now, that might mean nothing to you. Again, it's all part of a process for learning. I've been there. You don't have to worry about it too much. The opposite would be true for a hinge. Again, so you've got the posterior eccentrically biased, and you can imagine that enables the posterior part of the hips to sink back, receive load, yield, and send the hips back as you're doing a hinge. So it's slightly different for a squat and a hinge. Again, that's a big difference with regards to those two movement patterns. And again, huge thing. What dictates a good squat? Your ability to manage your center of mass. your ability to manage your axial skeleton. Now, for me, a huge thing here is your hamstrings and abs. Your hamstrings will control the position of your pelvis. You need to keep that nice and neutral for a squat so you can go, directly up and down. And the hamstrings do the job of controlling the pelvis. So you want those to be strong, both working kind of symmetrically to fix that pelvis in place so you can move up and down nicely. Second thing would be your abs. Now that holds, again, your pelvis in place, particularly your internal obliques, your external obliques, your obliques. Let's go there. Pelvis and rib cage will be stacked when those are on, and you can keep that nice kind of stacked position with pelvis, with the rib cage on top, with the skull on top of that, and that is a nice, beautiful stacked position that you can move up and down and load the quads and the glutes to the high heavens. So maintaining your ability to maintain that position, and that's all around creating a good intra-abdominal pressure with good breathing patterns in order to kind of maintain those good positions. Different parts of the squat will bias different movements, and this is where we'll get into the propulsion arc. So zone 1, that first 60 degrees of flexion at the femur, knees and ankles, all of that will bias an expansion zone. I'm not going to go too deep in this because, again, for a podcast it's a bit silly, but you've got your external rotation, your abduction, your supination, your plantar flexion, all of these things associated with expansion, basically things that go moving away from your midline, sending your center of mass outwards. And then you've got zone 2, which is the kind of middle portion of the squat, which is internal rotation bias, adduction bias, extension biased. And you see this on the way out of the squats when the knees might potentially come in as you're looking to put force into the ground, and you internally rotate, supinate the foot, and drive hard dorsiflex, pushing into the ground. And then back to the expansion zone at the bottom of the squat, which typically whereas you might see the knees coming back towards the chest, and then you're flexing a bit more generally throughout the system, externally rotating a bit more, abducting a little bit more, and these are just biases. You can use these 3 zones of kind of zone 1, expansion, zone 2, compression, zone 3, expansion, to bias and improve movement options. But again, we're not going to dive into that today. So that is what dictates a good squat, and the movement options associated with each part of a squat. Any questions, by the way? It's a bit more technical than I wanted it to be, but that's all right. We're going to roll with it. Therefore, when you're looking at a squat, what you want to see is, again, the axial skeleton, the torso moving up and down in a straight line. If that's happening while the knees move through a nice big juicy range of motion, you can almost guarantee that the quads are going to be smoked. And that's, again, if that's the outcome you're looking for, that's brilliant. And that's what I'd recommend for the outcome to be when you are doing a squatting pattern. How often to squat if you want to get good at squatting? Again, I think you can get good at squatting in a single session, and that is just with regards to the setup. Can you give them an anterior load? Can you raise their heels? If you tick those 2 boxes, everyone can squat nicely. I recently heard a term, motor moron, or just someone who's bad at moving. I think I really disagree with that term. I just think they don't have the constraints in order for them to move well. Motor moron is just like you just don't know how to coach them yet, or you can't figure out the constraints to enable them to move well. Maybe they're doing something for the first time. That's just skill acquisition, and the coach's job is to help them kind of figure out things better, faster, so they can move forward and progress nicely. So fuck that term. It's for shit coaches. So I would squat at least once a week. I try and get at least 1 squatting session per week just to maintain the quad musculature. Again, a lot of these deep yielding plyos that I've spoken about in the plyometric podcast yield so much. It's funny because they're called deep yielding and they yield a lot, but they yield a lot for the body. They're absolutely fantastic, and they give you so much with regards to tendon health, good quality movement, feeling good in these deeper joint angle positions in a flexion-based, biased body, they just yield so much. So a minimum squatting once a week if you want to get good. Again, trying to maintain these standards, doing some work to kind of figure out the position of your center of mass or your axial skeleton. And what it takes to get good at squatting. Just have a sip of water. Bear with me for 1 second. Yeah, what it takes to get good at squatting: axial skeleton positional competency. So again, that's just kind of organizing your torso nicely. Doing this with ground-based drills, a variation of a dead bug where you go through a breathing cycle and teach that ability to build a lot of intra-abdominal pressure, can really, really help with getting more out of your squatting. Again, with regard to this axial skeleton competency, the two main muscles will be your hamstrings and your obliques. Get those two muscles on and working. It's hard to get your axial skeleton in a bad position. So you want to learn how to feel your hamstrings and obliques working together to secure your axial skeleton, and that should enable you to smoke the quads and smoke the target tissues. That's also true for every single sagittal, frontal, and transverse variation of every exercise. If you've got good hamstrings holding the pelvis in a nice solid stacked position, good obliques holding the rib cage in a nice solid stacked position, the target tissues will get significantly more work because they've got a better structure, better structure to press through for a horizontal press, to pull through for a horizontal row, vertical, push and pull, everything, literally everything. Organize this structure, your torso, muscles start to work. So you need strong hamstrings and strong abs, and that will help you squat better. Again, developing strong quads and strong glutes by developing good, strong hamstrings and strong abs and doing the squatting pattern will naturally help you get better at squatting. So again, what does it take to get good at squatting? Getting strong hamstrings and abs, strong in terms of particular movements. So you can think a little posterior tilt of the pelvis to kind of stack it, and a anterior tilt of the rib cage to again stack it on top of the pelvis. Getting those two boxes ticked enable you to get stronger quads and glutes. And again, last thing, your ability to go through a nice full range of motion at every single joint in the body. Can you pronate and supinate your foot? You will go through a pronation and supination throughout a squat. This is why Squat University teaches some bullshit where you kind of he teaches you should act as if you're standing on paper and turn your legs out or twist your feet out. That just creates supination, but you need to go through pronation. You need that arch to come down so you can put force into the ground, particularly in that middle part of the squat, to really get the benefits of a squat. So again, these guys with PhDs are lacking this basic understanding that great coaches have figured out. So you need the ability to go through a full range of motion, flexion, extension, pronation, supination, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Every single movement option in the body, you need to be able to go through that for the previously discussed portions of a squat. Brilliant. I hope you got some value from this. If you have any questions or want me to go deeper on any of these subjects, please just drop me a message. I'm super happy to help. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I hope you have a great day, and thank you again for listening. Goodbye.